welcome to the meeting number 6 of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. Pursuant to the motion adopted on January 31st, the committee is meeting on the situation at the Taiwan Strait.
Interpretation is available through the globe icon at the bottom of your screen. And members participating in person, please keep in mind the Board of Internal Economy guidelines for mask use and health protocols. Veuillez noter également que les captures de l'écran.
Please note that screenshots or photos of your screen are not authorized.
Wait until I recognize you by name. And when speaking, please speak slowly and clearly. When you're not speaking, your mic should be on mute. J'aimerais également vous rappeler que
I would also like to remind you that all the interventions of MPs and witnesses have to be addressed to the chair.
There is a potential vote scheduled within the next hour. If that does happen, pursuant to Standing Order 115.5, the committee requires unanimous consent to continue once the bells have begun. Et maintenant, j'aimerais souhaiter.
And now I'd like to welcome our witnesses.
Weldon Epp, Director General, North Asia. Kevin Hamilton, Directeur Général Politique de Sécurité Internationale.
Director General for Ethics of International Security Policy.
Oceans, Environment and Aerospace Law. Jordan Reeves, Directeur
Executive Director of the Canadian Trade Office in Taipei. Thank you very much, Mr. Reeves, for joining us at this time.
Mary Catherine Spears, Executive Director, Trade Policy and Negotiations, Asia. Colleagues, I understand that Mr. Epp will deliver the opening remarks for our panel. I will give the floor to him now for opening remarks of 5 minutes, and we will then go into rounds of questions as usual. Mr. Epp, please go ahead. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I'm pleased to be here today to respond to questions on the situation concerning Taiwan, together with colleagues from the International Security Bureau, Legal and Trade Policy Bureaus at GAC, as well as, of course, our head of mission in Taipei, the executive director of the Canadian Trade Office in Taipei, who's stayed up late especially.
Since 1970, Canada has developed extensive cultural and people-to-people ties with Taiwan under the One China policy. Under this policy, Canada recognizes the People's Republic of China, the PRC, as the sole legitimate government of China, while acknowledging but not challenging or endorsing the Chinese government's position on Taiwan. This framework has allowed Canada to build informal but substantive ties with Taiwan based on our complementary interest, our shared values, and the rule of law, while maintaining diplomatic relations and pursuing our interests with the PRC.
Modern, prosperous, and democratic society, Taiwan is globally connected and has an international footprint to match. There are currently around 60,000 Canadians living in Taiwan, which makes the island the home of one of the largest Canadian diaspora communities in the world. These direct people-to-people links are supported by daily nonstop flights and deep trade relations with two-way trade in merchandise valued at, in 2021, $10.2 billion, up 38.1% year on year. Taiwan is Canada's 15th largest trading partner and a critical member of global supply chains, particularly for chip manufacturing and international shipping. During the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, allant de la santé mondiale à l'aviation civile.
Going from global health to civil aviation, Canada has always supported Taiwan's effective participation in global discussions where there's a practical imperative and where Taiwan's absence would be detrimental to global interests. Despite international efforts to promote greater inclusion in international organizations such as the World Health Assembly or the International Civil Aviation Organization, Taiwan remains excluded from important discussions where its presence would benefit the international community.
In the past 4 months, we have observed a significant increase in military activity, including over 600 incursions into Taiwan's self-declared air defense identification zone by the PLA Air Force. And whatever the motivations, Canada believes these moves threaten regional security and only serve to push back the possibility of dialogue and cooperation across the Taiwan Strait. For its part, Canada has communicated directly to the Chinese authorities its concerns about destabilizing military actions across the strait, while reiterating Canada's strong support for constructive efforts that contribute to peace and stability in the region. To be clear, we remain committed to advancing our interests with Taiwan within the framework of, and I should emphasize, Canada's One China policy. Canadian engagement with Taiwan is multifaceted and has on its own merits an important role to play in advancing Canadian interests. The value to our two societies goes beyond the cross-strait security question. As our sixth largest trading partner in the Indo-Pacific, Taiwan's economic stability matters to Canadian exporters. For instance, recognizing Taiwan's crucial position in global supply chains, Canada recently launched exploratory discussions on a possible foreign investment promotion and protection arrangement with Taiwan. Mr. Chair, as a progressive democracy, Taiwan demonstrates that Confucian values and individual rights and freedoms, including for women, the LGBTQ community, and Indigenous peoples, can coexist. Canada has many other unique reasons to advance its ties with Taiwan without reference to the agenda of third parties. This long-standing approach has guided Canada's engagement with Taiwan for over 5 decades and will remain a cornerstone of our continued engagement in the future. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Epp, thank you very much, and thank you for sticking to the time limit. In fact, you're under. I was just going to mention to colleagues and the panel as well, I will continue to use, I think this has been helpful, a 30-second flashcard just to give you guidance when your time comes to an end, whether it's a colleague member of the committee speaking or a witness. When you see this card, please try to wrap up your remarks. The allocations are quite tightly timed and negotiated, so I'd be grateful for adherence to them. We will now go to our first round, which is a set of 6-minute interventions by members of the committee, and the first of which goes to Mr. Chung. Mr. Chung, you have the floor for 6 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Minister Jolie's mandate letter instructs her to develop an Indo-Pacific strategy. 2 quick questions. When will the strategy be released, and will it be made public?
So, Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. As you mentioned, the Indo-Pacific strategy has been identified as a policy priority for the government, both in mandate letters and in the speech from the throne. That policy is under development, and our advice to ministers continues to be prepared. And so I'm not in a position to speak to the timelines for that at this time.
Okay. Will it be made public?
Again, the exact nature of the approach to communicate this both diplomatically and publicly, I can't speak to, but the anticipation is that, yes, it will be.
Yes, it will be. Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate that answer. Last October, Royal Canadian Navy frigate HMCS Winnipeg sailed through the Taiwan Strait alongside U.S. destroyer USS Dewey. The United States classifies these operations as freedom of navigation operations. The Canadian government does not. What does the Canadian government classify this operation as?
Mr. Chair, with your permission, I'd like to turn to my colleague Kevin Hamilton from our International Security Bureau to provide a response on that.
Thank you, Weldon. So, Mr. Chair, the United States, as the member correctly notes, conducts freedom of navigation operations throughout the world, but particularly in the Indo-Pacific region. The transit or the joint transit of the Taiwan Strait between HMCS Winnipeg and USS Dewey was not actually would not fall into the category of what the United States classifies as a FAAE, a freedom of navigation operation. Both the Dewey and the Winnipeg traveled exactly equidistant between mainland China and Taiwan. So the 2 vessels were in fact passing through international waters. Different operations that the United States undertakes, which are classified as FAAE, move into territories or territorial waters that are claimed, rightly or wrongly, by one country or another. That was not the case in this transit of the Taiwan Strait.
Well, the People's Republic of China claims much of the South China Sea as its territorial waters. So, are you suggesting that that's not the case?
It's the case that China does claim much of the South China Sea as its territorial waters. Canada does not take a position on claims by any particular country.
We don't. we don't oppose China's claims to the South China Sea, seeing that the court in The Hague upheld UN law and ruled against China in respect of its claim to the South China Sea.
I may defer to my colleague Stephen Randall on that question, who's director of our Oceans Law division. But outside particular claims put towards under the court in The Hague, as you mentioned, and the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, my understanding is that we typically do not take a position on the various claims in the South China Sea.
Look, I've got more questions. I'm surprised at that because China clearly lost the case in international court based on international law, the Convention of the Law of the Sea, with respect to its claim to the South China Sea. So I'm surprised that Canada, the government's position is not to uphold that court ruling. My other question has to do with President Xi and President Putin. President Xi and President Putin recently met where they issued a joint statement of some 5,000 words, which some people are calling an alliance of autocracies. What is the government of Canada's position on this new alliance between Russia and the People's Republic of China?
Mr. Chair, if I might begin the response to that, I think it's a development that we are monitoring very closely. We take note of the statements released. Canada is concerned with growing disruption to longstanding principles and practice in international law. The Canadian government has repeatedly, with partners, whether with respect to activities by the Chinese government that break rules and norms in international law, or those of the Russian government, spoken out, both bilaterally and through fora like the G7. The issue that the honourable member raises is one of great concern, and we continue to monitor it closely.
Thank you. Just a very quick question. Does the government support Taiwan's ascension to the CPTPP?
Just a brief answer, please.
I'll turn to my colleague from our Trade Policy Branch for that, please. Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, Canada does not have a position on Taiwan's application at this time. At this time, the parties to the CPTPP are focused on the accession process for the United Kingdom. As with any accession application, Canada would need to undertake an analysis in order to properly assess the implications, and are at this time our position on any aspirant economy seeking to join the CPTPP will be guided by the best interests of Canadians.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Spears. Thank you, Mr. Chung. Maintenant, je passe la parole à Madame Bandayan pour 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup. I now give the floor to Madame Bandayan for 6 minutes.
That are here today on this important question. I met recently with Representative Chen, as you know, the representative of Taiwan here in Canada, based out of Ottawa, and it is a priority of his that we should conclude a foreign investment promotion and protection agreement, also known as a FAAE, with Taiwan. On January 9th, 2022, Minister Ng also spoke with Minister John Deng from Taiwan, and during that meeting, the two ministers agreed to begin exploratory discussions on a FAAE. Can you perhaps elaborate and speak to this recent announcement of exploratory discussions between Canada and Taiwan?
So, Mr. Chair, I'll turn to my colleague again, Ms. Spears, in a moment to speak to developments in trade policy. I guess what I'd like to say at the top is that Canada has a very robust relationship and strong interests in promoting more integration of our trade relationship with Taiwan. Taiwan plays an incredibly important role in global supply chains, not least in the tech sector. One of the largest Canadian investments in Asia is in Taiwan. We've seen increased investments into Canada, not least through the work of Mr. Reeves, but also Mr. Chen here. And we look forward to pursuing exploratories that might identify ways to strengthen those two-way relationships. And Ms. Spears can speak to this or the next steps and the process.
Thank you. Perhaps Ms. Spears, you can focus on the timeline for the FAAE in that case.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Canada is presently pursuing exploratory discussions as a first step towards potential negotiations for a foreign investment promotion and protection arrangement with Taiwan. There are exploratory discussions scheduled in February and in March. They are a first step in assessing our levels of ambition and if so, whether we are in a position to recommend moving to formal negotiations.
Thank you. Picking up on a question from my colleague, Mr. Chong, I would be interested in also hearing about something again that Mr. Chen raised. There is an obvious interest for Taiwan to be able to join other international organizations. ICAO was mentioned specifically. Can you provide the committee with a bit of an overview of how Canada is supporting Taiwan in this regard, particularly with respect to its interest in joining ICAO?
So, Mr. Chair, I'd be happy to take that question in the first instance and turn to my colleague, our head of mission in Taipei, to elaborate. Canada has repeatedly stated both through the Prime Minister's own statements and various ministers, but also in our position taken at relevant international organizations, that the Canadian position is that we welcome participation of Taiwan in the international community and in organizations where the context permits, and the interest of the international community of having the participation of Taiwan's 24 million people at the table merits. And that's included, but not been limited to, pressing for Taiwan's observer status, which it at one point enjoyed at the WHA, the World Health Assembly, with respect to the work of the WHO. It's also included our efforts to ensure that when it comes to aviation and aviation security and safety, that Taiwan's participation at ICAO is facilitated. Canada will continue to push for those. There are other fora in which Taiwan has a seat or plays a meaningful role, including in various fisheries organizations. And as the committee will be aware, Canada works with Chinese Taipei in the context of the WTO and APEC. And so where possible, our policy has always been to be pragmatic and look at ways in which we can increase the effectiveness of those organizations, not least over one of the more dynamic and important economies in the Asia-Pacific region. We do this together with partners who share that view and share the view that, particularly given its democratic government and governance and its dynamic economy, that Taiwan brings a lot to many tables. And so we do that through coordination with like-minded and through conversations with the secretariats of the organizations mentioned. I'd like to just turn to Executive Director Reeves to speak a bit about some of the ways we do this, not least through other bodies like something called the GCTF. Jordan?
Sure, thanks, Weldon. Yes, well, the GCTF, actually, that is a good example. This is a platform called the Global Cooperation Training Framework Program based in Taiwan. There are a couple of other partners. US and Japan are the principal partners. Australia has just joined. This is a platform that Taiwan uses to promote essentially good governance throughout the region and beyond. And so for the very first time this past year, Canada co-organized one of the sessions and joined with the other partners. This one was on women's political participation. So we had the Honorable Rona Ambrose on as one of the speakers on that panel, and also Carol James, former Deputy Premier of British Columbia as well. So, I mean, that is one example where it's a great example where we can be working with Taiwan and alongside other like-minded partners in the region. As Director General Epp has so eloquently explained, yes, Canada has been quite consistent in calling for an inclusive approach, non-politicized approach to international organizations, especially when it comes to dealing with issues, environment, aviation safety was mentioned, certainly health, the latest pandemic that do not respect political boundaries. And on ICAO, I'll just say one other.
Sir Reeves, I apologize.
Okay.
I think we'll have to leave it there. There'll be an opportunity to follow up in successive rounds, but thank you very much. Merci beaucoup, Madame Bendayan. Maintenant, je passe la parole à Monsieur Bergeron.
Thank you, Mrs. Bendayan. Now, Mr. Bergeron, the floor is yours for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for having taken the time to enlighten us on this situation, which is evolving, and the cooperation between Canada and Taiwan. I'd like to thank Mr. Reeves, given the late hour for him. I'm following the Beijing Olympic Games, and understanding that the different time zones really manifest themselves as the games go on longer. I have to say that I was quite surprised by the answer given to Mr. Chong's question on the Taiwan Strait and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but I will not criticize you for that. We want to have open and honest discussion, and not just repeating official speech lines. So thank you very much. You know that the Taiwan president created a working group under the aegis of the National Security Council in order to follow closely the evolving situation between Russia and Ukraine and to see what impact that might have on Taiwan. We dealt with this question last week in a sitting dealing with the situation between Russia and Ukraine, and Professor Anissa Gimbel from Laval University was telling us that the focus of attention of the West was turned towards Ukraine, and there's very little attention given to Taiwan. However, surprisingly, during an open discussion session on October 21st last year, we asked President Biden if the U.S. was going to defend Taiwan if China attacked them. And he said, yes, we're committed to do that. So we know that the U.S. has already taken the commitment to not intervene if Ukraine is invaded. So was Professor Kimball ill-informed when she told us that Western people were more concerned with the Ukraine situation? And the second question, aligned with President Biden's reply, in case of an invasion of Taiwan, would Canada be ready to intervene in a military way?
The question, and as we know, and as the member mentioned, colleagues from Global Affairs Canada were before the committee recently to speak about the situation in Ukraine, and I know that the comparison with Taiwan came up in that context. It's very much a discussion point. I would say that this committee and Global Affairs, the government, are very alive to that issue. We continue to watch closely, not least because whether you're sitting in Moscow or Beijing or Taipei or Ottawa for that matter, there is a risk that developments in Ukraine present a sort of a unwelcome natural experiment, if you would, that will allow various parties to watch closely and see what the effectiveness of different diplomatic tools are to respond to, in a very alarming situation. I would say, notwithstanding that, Canada remains very concerned separately with developments in the Taiwan Strait. We mentioned off the top in the opening statement the increasing operational pace of very unwelcome and destabilizing incursions from the PLA Air Force. And those are also, unfortunately, opportunities to test potential options for the future. And so the Canadian government is monitoring all those developments very closely. And each are quite unique and separate, but of course there are some cross-pollinations in terms of how international diplomacy and various means of responding to coercion, be it outright or through other means, are most effectively done. Mr. Chair, I'll hand the time back to you.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for acknowledging that these are two distinct problematical situations. We'd agree on that, but thank you for acknowledging that they're quite directly related one to the other. And I think that the joint statement by President Xi and President Putin a few days ago that my colleague Michael Chong was referring to shows a rapprochement between Russia and China, including on the Taiwan issue. So there is a link to be made between the two situations. And given that you don't want to talk about the connection that might be established between both of them, let's speak of the situation in Taiwan. If the PRC were to invade the island, given the Canada's one China policy, what would the Canadian government's reaction be?
I'd like to speak to that. I have very limited time, but I won't speak to the hypothetical of various future scenarios. What I would say is because China, in its own words, has never ruled out, never precluded using force to reunify with Taiwan, Canada is deeply concerned by recent activities. I'll just speak to the facts as we see them rather than to some hypothetical future. Those increasing activities by the PLA Air Force, but also not just overt activity by the military, also what we would call below threshold activities that include things like cyber attacks, interference, United Front tactics. We're alive to all of those, and we will continue to monitor those together with partners and to continue to encourage both sides to step back from provocative actions, particularly the Chinese side, which has changed the dynamic recently in the last year, and to seek dialogue and the space to maintain stability and resolve their outstanding historical differences through peaceful dialogue. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Epp. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Bergeron. And the final
Thank you, Mr.
Bergeron. In the opening round goes to Ms. McPherson. Please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I would like to thank the witnesses for coming and sharing their expertise with us today. Happy Valentine's Day to all of the witnesses and to the members of the committee. I'd like to follow up a little bit on some of the questions that Mr. Bergeron has asked, because of course, we're all very preoccupied with what is happening in Ukraine and the potential for an invasion by Russia. So it's interesting to get your perspectives on that. I would like to know if the Canadian government believes that a Russian invasion of Ukraine would make Chinese aggression towards Taiwan more likely, and if you could give me a little bit of clarity on why or why not that's the case.
So, Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. I think we need to be frank here, whether it's think tanks, academics, or governments. We are all monitoring developments in the Ukraine, not least for the question that you're raising. Of course, it's very dynamic. And again, I'm not going to speak to, how the government would respond or what we assess the likelihood of that impact at this time, and given the open line that we're using for this call. But what I would say is that, let's stick to what we know. If I would say that with respect to China, we know that China has been quite explicit in identifying what its own strategic goals are. And those goals, in the words of Xi Jinping, include national rejuvenation by 2049. And he's made an implicit link, but of course, we all understand that rejuvenation would definitely include reunification with Taiwan. And so there is increasing concern that China may be putting a timeline on those goals to achieve its general rejuvenation of and make its achieve its goal of becoming a great power globally, but also the predominant regional power by 2049. It's been investing heavily in its military, And we see, activities within the region that are increasingly alarming, not just in the Taiwan Strait. And so,
Mr. Epp, I'm sorry to interrupt you just for a moment. We have bells that are currently ringing. I've just hit the pause button on this intervention. We need unanimous consent by the committee in this case to continue to work. Customarily, if the committee grants it, it's usually for no more than 15 minutes, and I think it's a 30-minute bell. Do we have unanimous consent to continue for an additional or up to an additional 15 minutes? Is that enough time for colleagues to cast their votes? Any opposition? Okay, we will continue for 15 minutes on my clock. That would put us to
point of order, Mr. Chair. Can I seek consent to extend for another 10 minutes beyond the proposed 15? We can vote by app, so I don't think we need more.
Sure, if colleagues feel that that's okay. Do you want to put a particular time on it? 25 minutes.
We've agreed to 15. I would say extend it by another 10 on top of that.
So 25 minutes.
Yeah.
Any opposition from colleagues? Okay, you seem to have agreement, Mr. Tenuous. Thanks very much. I will pass the floor back to Mr. Epp with my apologies.
Mr. Chair, perhaps I'll pause there and turn it back to you.
Thank you. I'll step in, and I do understand that we are asking you questions on hypotheticals, and that is always a bit of a challenge. But I think that knowing that the situation that we are finding ourselves in, that this is something that the committee is deeply concerned about. And I guess when we look at what's happening in Ukraine and the potential for Russian aggression in Ukraine, my other worry or my other concern, and I'd like some more information about, is how what happened in Hong Kong over the last several years has impacted what's happening in Taiwan. So knowing that Taiwan is a progressive, democratic, been governed in that democratic way, I'd love to get some context on, first of all, the human rights protections, the human rights that are happening in Taiwan, the reality around things like LGBT plus rights, indigenous rights, women's rights, and how you would see that interacting with what happened in Hong Kong in 2019 and latter.
So, Mr. Chair, let me make a quick response to that, and then I'd like to turn it over to our Executive Director of our CTOT in Taipei to speak to the latter part of the question. I think obviously Canada, with others, has spoken out, been on the record, and taken policy decisions to respond to the deterioration of rights and freedoms under the implementation of the national security law in Hong Kong. Those developments came quickly, not least opportunistically because of conditions provided by COVID, and Canada and others have looked at that with concern. Taiwan is a very different situation in the sense that the processes and the tools that were used to shift those goalposts in Hong Kong were effectively done through legislative means and law enforcement. Obviously, Taiwan de facto is administered by a different government, a democratically elected one, and as you point out, one that has been a bastion of human rights and progressive policies within the region. So with that, I'd like to turn it over, if I might, Mr. Chair, to Jordan Reeves.
Yes, thank you. I could just comment a little bit further, perhaps, that what we saw happening in Hong Kong had a profound impact on Taiwan and Taiwanese politics, for sure. So in Taiwan, basically, the Hong Kong reality of what happened with the national security law basically told most Taiwanese that one country, two systems was clearly out. It was no longer an option for the majority of Taiwanese. We saw this correspond with an increase in the number of people in Taiwan that also identify themselves as Taiwanese, as opposed to being both Taiwanese and Chinese or only Chinese. So I think the latest numbers we have for the end of last year, 62.3% of the Taiwanese population now identify as being purely Taiwanese. Many of these tend to be the younger Taiwanese, and they tend to be strong supporters of the current administration. That's the DPP party, which to generalize, to simplify a little bit, is considered to be the pro-independence party in Taiwan. So this did have a profound impact on the local politics. It was in 2018, after local elections, there were many who saw that there was an opportunity for the opposition, KMT, which has usually been taken a stance that is a little bit closer to China as making a comeback. But as a result of the Hong Kong situation in that context, the politics shifted in Taiwan and President Tsai was reelected. So we see some of the impacts of that within the region. And so that would probably be the largest impact that the situation in Hong Kong had on Taiwan as Taiwanese watched what happened there.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Reeves. Thank you very much, Ms. McPherson. There'll be an opportunity to follow up in subsequent rounds. We will now go into our second round of questions, and leading us off will be Mr. Genuis with a 5-minute round. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Order paper question 41, which was mine, was with respect to AUKUS and Indo-Pacific strategy. I had asked about if Canada is interested in becoming part of AUKUS, about Canadian views of and engagement with AUKUS. The response understandably noted the role of nuclear submarines as part of AUKUS, and it says, quote, Canada has not and does not seek to be directly involved in the nuclear-powered submarine aspects of this trilateral arrangement, which is fair enough, but it seems to leave a lot unsaid. Is Canada interested in being involved in the non-nuclear power submarine aspects of this agreement?
Mr. Chair, with your permission, I'll turn to my colleague Kevin Hamilton to respond to
that. Thank you, Weldon. So, Mr. Chair, the member is quite correct that there are other aspects of the AUKUS agreement beyond the centerpiece, which was the Australian acquisition of nuclear submarines. There are aspects such as advancing applied research and innovation, emerging technologies, artificial intelligence, quantum computing. These are areas and aspects that we deal with the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia already in the context of the Five Eyes arrangement. And so the question of whether Canada would need to be part of AUKUS to continue with those very important aspects of our relationship is somewhat moot. We have that relationship already, and leaving aside the nuclear submarine aspect, which, as the member correctly notes, we're not particularly interested in right now. We feel that we've got that relationship and it is strong. Thank you.
I'm a bit confused by that answer insofar as, of course, these countries, some of these countries are already, all of the countries involved in AUKUS are part of the Five Eyes, and they already cooperate on the areas you mentioned. But they are committing to presumably further and deeper cooperation by signing on to AUKUS. Should I infer from your response that there is nothing new in these areas with respect to AUKUS, or there are things that are new being advanced in terms of cooperation? Because if there are things that are new that are being committed to, then that Canada is not a part of, then that's potentially a problem, is it not?
So, Mr. Chair, it's my understanding that there is no exclusivity with respect to those other areas of the AUKUS agreement that would exclude Canada or New Zealand, the other partners of Five Eyes. What AUKUS does is create that essentially a commercial deal around the nuclear submarine procurement, and then re-emphasizes the other aspects of cooperation in those areas that I mentioned earlier.
So your understanding of those other aspects of AUKUS is it simply re-emphasizing or repeating things that are already committed to in the context of Five Eyes cooperation?
That is my understanding, yes.
Okay. On another matter, have any ministers from the current government since 2015 met with representatives of the Taipei Economic and Cultural Office here in Ottawa?
Mr. Chair, to my knowledge, they have not.
Is there a reason why that would be the case?
Mr. Chair, there is no specificity in our One China policy that would preclude it.
Okay, what's the most senior level of official or member of the government that has met with representatives of that office?
Mr. Chair, to my knowledge, apart from ongoing engagement, including by myself and other members of senior management within our department, most recently through the annual Canada-Taiwan Economic Cooperation Platform. That's our annual Joint Planning Council. It would be at the Assistant Deputy Minister level.
Why did Canadian government officials not want to see Tsai Ing-wen receive the John McCain Prize from the Halifax Security Forum?
So, Mr. Chair, with respect, I'm not sure I would agree entirely with the premise of the question. I think what's on the record is that Minister Sajjan, then Minister of Defence, had made it clear to Parliament that the Government of Canada supports the Halifax International Symposium, will continue to do so, and that the decisions taken by that independent Canadian conference or institution will remain independent, including who they invite to meetings and who they choose to provide awards or recognition to.
Were any representation?
Mr. Genius, I apologize. That's
Mr.
Genius. That's your time. We'll have an opportunity to follow up, I'm sure. And thank you very much, Mr. Epp. We'll now go to Dr. Fry for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you everyone for coming and giving us such great answers. But I wanted to focus on a big picture issue here. I mean, I've heard my colleague Michael Chong, and we've heard others, Heather McPherson, ask about the broader implications. When we are seeing a global sort of movement to get rid of democracy, and given that we know Taiwan is democratic, we know that Ukraine is democratic. We see Russia doing what it's doing in Ukraine. We see China taking steps against Hong Kong and against Taiwan. Invading airspace, moving very close to the naval lines, et cetera, et cetera. Is there a sense that this is part of a joint action to get rid of democracy in the two major regions, i.e. Europe and of course Asia Pacific? Because we know that we're members of the G7, and the Japanese Prime Minister talked a lot about that free and open concept in the Indo-Pacific region. Is this something that you're concerned about? What is Canada? Is Canada planning a longer-term strategy to ensure that the democracy remains clear, rule of law, free and fair elections, freedom of the press, all of which are being denied right now by both of those countries, both China and of course, adherence to human rights, but being China and Russia are absolutely ignoring those. Are we concerned about that big picture, that long-range plan to rid the world of democratic institutions and democratic nations?
So, Mr. Chair, that's a big question, but I'd like to thank the member for it. I would like to speak to that in a couple of ways. I think, and if I might, in doing so, also take the opportunity to return to the question of the international, of the Canadian sort of mandate letters to ministers and statement in the speech of the throne of the desire to come forward with an Indo-Pacific strategy, as the member just raised that as well. That will be the context going forward, as we understand it, for the government to reinvest in and communicate even more clearly our commitment to the values of rule of law, of principles that we've invested in and fought for in the Asia and Indo-Pacific region, particularly on the Korean Peninsula, where we continue to work with partners to uphold the rule of law, not least sanctions, to prevent nuclear proliferation. Canada, as you know, has been very active in participating in augmenting a rules-based approach to the region in international trade, and my colleague Ms. Spears can speak directly to that in the context of the CPTPP, but also bilateral FTAs. And I think, to the question of democracy across that landscape, which at points can be kind of bleak, we have numerous partners within the Indo-Pacific region with which we share a commitment to democratic governance, to human rights, and to the rule of law. And those include Taiwan. And so, as Executive Director Reeves mentioned earlier, rather than only working to include Taiwan more meaningfully where it should be and where our interests, require it in international organizations, we also need to be creative in working with Taiwan and other partners through platforms like the GCTF to amplify its experiences, not least, for example, in the area of media freedoms, where I think we know Taiwan has an incredibly robust and very, frankly, very active domestic media context. Those are the sorts of values and practices that Canada shares with Taiwan, and we want to work through a number of platforms to do so. To your
Yes, no, go ahead. Yes, I wanted to ask you another question, so if you could.
Just to quickly, with respect to as the government develops a new Indo-Pacific strategy, I want to just emphasize that has not stopped decisions being taken to move forward and work more closely with our partners, not least Japan. And you mentioned the free and open Indo-Pacific approach of the Japanese, and you will have seen last year in summer that the Canadian government announced further deeper cooperation with Japan within that framework.
I just wondered, and I know you don't like hypothetical. Nobody likes hypothetical questions. It makes an idiot out of all of us if we answer them. But what I wanted to say is, Ukraine is a sovereign nation. Taiwan is not. And so my question is, will an emboldened, not that China needs to be emboldened any further, will an emboldened China follow through on what Russia is doing in Ukraine? And if so, who are we going to be allied with in that case we have to take a step?
And just a very quick answer, please.
Again, I think Canadians will look forward to hearing from the government as it develops an Indo-Pacific strategy, which will address some of those issues as it comes forward.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fry. Monsieur Bergeron, s'il vous plaît, 2 minutes et demie.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will continue in the same vein. I was a bit surprised by the answer given by Mr. Epp, saying that, first of all, he didn't want to answer a hypothetical question on the possible invasion of Taiwan by the PRC, but saying that the latter never closed the door to acting by force to reunify China. And in terms of answering hypothetical questions, I think Canada clearly indicated what it was going to do under the hypothetical new invasion of Ukraine. So why this resistance to answering the question of a possible invasion of Taiwan, knowing that there are many Canadian citizens living on the island who are very interested in knowing what the Canadian government would do in the possibility of a invasion of the island?
Well, Mr. Chair, I just want to be clear, hypothetical or not, Canada does have a policy, and we've been consistent for 50 years under our One China policy in calling on both sides to seek to resolve outstanding differences through dialogue and peaceful means. As to, the potential future actions taken by one side or the other, we need to respond to events as they evolve and not preclude the possibility of more positive outcomes. But what I've said in my earlier comments are that we are deeply concerned with actions being taken by the Chinese side, which are both adding pressure and tension to the region, but also potentially being seen as a dress rehearsal for future actions. And the Chinese government, as I said, has never ruled out reunification by force, but is also active in other means of putting pressure on Taiwan. And we're alive to all of those, including economic coercion, including limiting and reducing Taiwan's international space, including the kind of activity we've seen recently with respect to Lithuania and the EU. And that's why the government joined just last week, or is seeking to join in consultations on the WTO, the EU's action against China in the WTO with respect to Lithuania. Canada will continue to stand up and oppose economic coercion, as well as more overt military coercion and sort of threats. And I would lastly say that, as you've seen in the last year, and my colleague Mr. Hamilton can speak to this more further, but given the rising tensions, not just in the Taiwan Strait, but across the region, East China Sea, South China Sea, you will have seen an uptick in operational frequency of deploying Royal Canadian Navy assets in that region, working with our partners undertaking new interoperable exercises. All of those are part of our preparations and contributions to stability today and in the future in that region.
Thank you very much. Merci, Monsieur Bergeron. Thank you, Mr. Epp. Colleagues, we've moved inside of the 10-minute time frame to the vote. What I propose is that we give our colleague, Ms. McPherson, the floor for her 2.5 minutes, which will take us very close, not quite to 5 minutes, but close to. And I'm also advised that we have the capacity on the House of Commons side to extend to 1:15. So if colleagues want to check their schedules and obligations, I'd like to do that by consensus if the committee agrees to do it, if possible. But just to turn your minds to that possibility. In the meantime, Ms. McPherson, you have the floor now for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to follow up on the Indo-Pacific strategy and when we can expect and what that will look like. So I know that you'd answered my colleague, Mr. Chong, and said that you didn't know when it was going to be done and when it will be release and whether or not it would be public, but that their plan was for that strategy to be public. Obviously, very important for parliamentarians to have access to that strategy so that we can actually see how it's being implemented. But one of the questions that I have, one of my key concerns is the feminist foreign policy that we also have not seen yet that is meant to be released by the government. How will we ensure that the Indo-Pacific strategy incorporates the FFP? The FFP, and what will that look like? What are the processes that are in place right now to ensure that that happens?
So, Mr. Chair, I appreciate the question, and let me respond to it in a moment. But if I might take the opportunity just to provide an important clarification in responding to this member's question, but to the question raised earlier by Mr. Chong, I did not mean to infer or imply in saying that the Indo-Pacific strategy would be made public, that the entire strategy will or won't be. That will be the government's decision. And I cannot, as an official, predict that. What I can say is that the intent is to publicly communicate and diplomatically communicate very robustly our strategic objectives and the way in which that strategy will advance those. And so I apologize if I misspoke. I didn't mean it to mean literally the strategy or policy as such will be released. You can understand that elements of it may continue to be classified given their sensitivity, but the intent is to engage, and to the question just raised, on the wide range of Canadian interests that we have in the region. Canada is no stranger to the region. We have long history of engaging not just in security and in governance or trade, but also in development. So to the question on the feminist foreign policy, the government's policy has not changed. And as we look at creative and new ways to use development assistance tools to more effectively engage on shared goals and values with our partners in the Indo-Pacific, we anticipate a very big opportunity to continue to advance the principles and objectives of the feminist foreign assistance policy of the government.
I'm not talking about the FAAE. I'm talking about the feminist foreign policy, not the feminist international assistance policy. Maybe I'll get more clarity on that because I'm assuming I'm out of time. So maybe I'll get more clarity on that.
If Mr. Epp wants to put in a very quick answer to that last point, he's welcome to. Otherwise, we can follow up. We're now inside of 5 minutes.
Sorry, the point I would like to make is that the Indo-Pacific strategy will be building upon the foundations of the government's policies, including its feminist international policy.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. McPherson. Thank you, Mr. Epp. Colleagues, we will suspend now to allow everybody to cast their vote, and we will come back on, I would say, in about 15 minutes, would be the normal time frame. We stand suspended until then. Thank you. McPherson. I will now turn the floor to Mr. Abultaif for a 5-minute intervention. Mr. Abultaif, you have the floor. Please go ahead.
Mr. Chair,
Yeah.
Mr. Chair, if I could just raise I don't know if it's a point of order or not. You can rule on it if you wish. During Mr. Epp's responses to Mr. Genes's comment, it was the conversation was about senior officials from Canada having met with officials from Taipei. I just wanted, and it not my ego at stake here, and I may not be senior, but in 2021, I had 3 meetings with officials both from the Taipei office here in Ottawa and at the cultural office in Toronto. I think that should be on the record that we do have regular, relatively senior conversation with them.
Right. Mr. Oliphant, thank you. I'm not sure that's a point of order, but I think you'll have an opportunity to clarify that further if you wish in your own intervention, which is coming up. Mr. Genuis?
Yeah, just on that point of order. I mean, this is clearly an abuse of points of order. I'm interested in the update. Mr. Oliphant has rounds of questioning available to him.
Yes,
this is kind of an abusive process, and frankly, it should come off his time if he tries to engage in things. I mean, just deduct it from his time, and he can proceed with the rest of it, because it's not really fair to others to do that.
Mr. Genuis, thank you very much. In the meantime, the clock is running. I will give the floor right away to Mr. Abultaif. Please go ahead for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, unless it's not coming out of my own time. But thanks again. The question for Mr. Abb, would you be, for the sake of this report, to identify the One China policy for us in a brief fashion, if you
can? Sure, Mr. Chair, I'd be happy to. So Canada's One China policy forms the basis of Canada's bilateral official relations with China. But the policy has also allowed us to maintain unofficial but valuable people-to-people ties, trade and investment ties with Taiwan. At the time of Canada's recognition of the PRC, Canada took note of China's position on Taiwan, neither endorsing nor challenging that position.
Okay.
I would just say, I'll leave it there if you wish.
Yeah, well, thank you. There's no, this position you mentioned has been consistent for 50 years. There is no position right now on Taiwan joining the CPTPP. The relationship, there's no position on FAAE when it comes to Canada-China relations. And there's a new reality that is the relationship with China is not the same after the two Michaels situation. So in the sake of the report or the new policy that you are drafting or working on, so if there is no position on CPP, TPP, or Taiwan joining, there is no position or clear position on FAAE. What is the shape of that policy is going to be? What's in it that is going to be any different from the policy that we've been having for 50 years?
So thank you. And Mr. Chair, again, I hope members will understand I'm not in a position to speak to advice to ministers that's under development, but what I can do is assure the members of this committee that the Canada's One China policy and the way in which Canada has used that policy to navigate both official relations with China and pursuing our interests with the PRC, but also unofficial relations with Taiwan, has been marked by a very flexible approach. The policy, in effect, is by design, strategically ambiguous. It is not particularly prescriptive. We spoke about that a bit earlier in this conversation with respect to levels of access and such. By design, our One China policy and how we manage our interaction with Taiwan has successfully, for 50 years, allowed us to do more and more things that are in Canada's interests, growing trade, engaging further on education ties, on research and development, precisely because it's a very ambiguous and a very flexible approach that we've taken. That's
sorry to cut you off. After the two Michaels, there is no more flexibility. We've seen probably the ugly side of how far can China go in punishing countries like Canada, where the relationship was basically very balanced, as you just mentioned. So How far do you think China would go beyond what happened during the two Michael situation, where we don't really know the details of that? So how far they can go, and what will that mean for our future relationships and for the Indo-Pacific policy that we are trying to put together there?
So, Mr. Chair, a moment ago, I was speaking specifically to the flexibility and the longstanding kind of endurability of our one China policy vis-a-vis Taiwan and how we manage those relations. But with respect to the concerns raised by the honourable member, obviously, I think all Canadians share deep concern, and there was broad support, not just within Canada, but around the world for diplomacy, a creative new diplomacy taken to define and call out the sorts of activity that we see increasingly from China, which is disruptive to existing international rules and order and principles. So the Arbitrary Detention Initiative, which is coming up on its first anniversary soon and continues to garner support, is an example of that. I would also mention there's increasing work with like-minded to push back on what we would call economic coercion from China. So I mentioned earlier the decision of the government with respect to Lithuania.
Do you believe that we need to have a fundamental change to our China policy moving forward?
So, Mr. Chair, I don't think it's about my personal views in this regard, but we continue to serve the government with advice on how to evolve its approach to China.
What's that advice looking like?
So I think the government has been on the record a number of times, including in front of the Parliamentary Committee on China that was active before the last Parliament, to explain at a very high level that approach has evolved. We have a new assessment of China, and Canada will challenge China where we see it breaking or undermining international rules and principles, and we'll cooperate with China where we're able. And we need to continue to compete with like-minded and other partners to provide solutions and approaches that keep with the evolving geopolitical dynamic that we are all
thank you very much. We'll have to leave it there in the interest of time. We will now go to our next intervener, Mr. MP Sarai, please, for 5 minutes. Go ahead, sir. Mr. Sarai, you have the floor.
Hello?
I think we can hear you, Mr. Sarai. Go ahead, please. You have the floor for 5 minutes. Oh, apparently not. Madam Clerk, is there any way we can, I'm going to push pause here for a moment to see if we can get technical support to MP Sarai to see if we can get him connected on audio.
I'll try the other way. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I'll try this way. Hopefully interpretation is okay.
Mr. Sarai, could I please ask you to unplug and replug your microphone? It's not connected properly. Sure.
Is that better? Can you hear me now?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. My apologies. I hope. Okay. China's military has increased the frequency and number of its flights into Taiwan's air defense identification zone and has crossed the median line of the Taiwan Strait. What considerations appear to be motivating China's increased military activity in and near the Taiwan Strait?
So, Mr. Chair, if I might, I'll start by replying to that at a high level, and then I'll turn to my colleague, Mr. Hamilton, to see if he wants to add. I think, it's an excellent question. We're in close touch with like-minded, but also we speak to think tanks, including in Beijing, to understand China's motivations. I think I spoke earlier to the committee about sort of higher level motivations that China's been quite clear about. It sees reunification with Taiwan as an essential part of achieving its goals of becoming, meeting its centennial of the revolution in 2049 as a rejuvenated great power. The ways in which it would hope to achieve those objectives from a rhetorical point of view have actually been quite consistent. If you look at since 1979, when the party shifted from talking about the liberation of Taiwan in a more aggressive sense to talking about peaceful reunification, the rhetorical frame has been largely consistent, including under Xi Jinping, including in speeches most recently last year. What is changing is, apart from the rhetoric, we see incredible investment in its military capacity, to keep options open, you might say, to take advantage of a changing geopolitical environment, to take advantage of China's growing economic might, which has made an asymmetry both economically but militarily possible in 2022 in a way that wasn't in 1979. And so as China has grown and become more powerful, not surprisingly, that potential option for its goal of reunification has been heavily invested in. But as I said earlier, we continue to monitor and be concerned about other approaches, not just military. And we encourage both sides to take the time, to buy the time to maintain stability and dialogue for the possibility of peaceful resolution of their outstanding issues. Thank you.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, please, Mr. Chair, back to the member.
Mr. Chair, if I may ask, has the government made any formal diplomatic communications to China regarding its concern about the rising tensions in the Taiwan Strait?
Mr. Chair, yes, we have. We have done so both through bilateral diplomacy, both at a working level, if you would. At my level, we frequently have these conversations with the embassy here. Our embassy in Beijing raises these issues. Most recently, our Deputy Minister, Marta Morgan, raised it in a conversation with her counterpart from China. But we also, apart from bilateral communications, we use multilateral statements, including from the G7, several last year. And if you noted most recently, I think it was last week in the Prime Minister's readout of his conversation with his Japanese counterpart, concerns about rising tensions across the strait were raised in that as well.
And what are the risks of escalation? And if we misrepresent the situation in the Taiwan Strait, where we're seeing similar things happening in Ukraine right now, where tensions are high, what are the risks and ramifications of that in this situation in Taiwan?
So one of our concerns, Mr. Chair, is that any increase in operational frequency of activity, even if these are test flights, raises the risk in an incredibly busy sea lane and also airspace of accidents, of miscommunication, and the possibility that could spill into open tensions. But if I might turn to Mr. Hamilton, who follows these issues very closely, to see if he wants to add to that.
Thank you, Weldon. Really, I don't have much more to add. That was an excellent answer. I would just reiterate that anytime there's an increase to operational tempo, there's risk of accident, there's risk of misinterpretation, and certainly what mainland China has been doing with respect to incursions over Taiwan is not conducive to preservation of international peace and security. It is a destabilizing situation which we monitor on a daily basis. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Sarai. Thank you to the witnesses. We will now go to our third round. Leading us off will be Mr. Morantz with 5 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I realized that you said earlier that you couldn't comment on what we would do in the event of an incursion by China in the Taiwan Strait. I'm just wondering if you could elaborate on what measures are available to the Government of Canada in such event.
So, Mr. Chair, I think what the Canadian government has developed and deployed in situations where we oppose the use of either military force in international contexts, or, for example, in human rights within borders. One of the options that has been used in the past has been economic sanctions. This committee will be aware that the Canadian government undertook economic sanctions against China for the first time in the context of our concerns about human rights abuses in Xinjiang last year. Obviously, Canada continues to enforce both UN and bilateral sanctions in the case of the DPRK. So sanctions is one of the tools. It's not the only one of the tools. I think one of the concerns that Canada would continue to pursue, given the increased tension we've seen in the Strait, is to continue to, if I might put it this way, encourage both sides, but particularly through our engagement with Taiwan, as that's the topic today, to develop peaceful engagement across the Strait, but with other partners in the region. And so Mr. Reeves mentioned the GCTF. We will double down on our approach to support our exporters and investors with respect to Taiwan. We passed an arrangement to support the avoidance of double taxation a couple years ago. So some of the bilateral tools that we can use to support trade and people-to-people engagement with Taiwan are, frankly speaking, an important part of maintaining confidence and normalcy for the people of Taiwan, even as they face increasing military threats, and to buy the time to find more peaceful ways to resolve those conflicts. Canada's always been clear, we're opposed to any unilateral action that would destabilize the situation in the Taiwan Strait.
Thank you. I want to circle back to the joint statement. One of the things that the joint statement said, and presumably China supports because it signed on to the statement, was that ruling out NATO expansion in Eastern Europe. Are you concerned that China has now embarked on a foreign policy designed to interfere with the decisions of NATO?
Mr. Chair, I must turn to my colleague, Mr. Hamilton, for that question.
Thank you, Weldon. Mr. Chair, it's a very interesting question. NATO right now is going through what is a renewal of a strategic concept. It's something that's done roughly every decade. It is happening right now. Its results will be announced this summer at the Madrid NATO summit. But one of the issues under discussion is the necessity of the North Atlantic Alliance, even though it is a Euro-Atlantic alliance, having a 360-degree threat perception and the ability to deal with challenges and indeed threats which may come from outside Euro-Atlantic space. And China is explicitly mentioned in that view, in that regard. And so we're very live to China's role in the region, China's relationship and efforts. Often,
my time's pretty short, but I get the picture. I just wanted to ask you. Obviously, China is watching what's going on in Ukraine very closely, and although the situations aren't completely analogous, there are many parts of the two situations that are very similar. If the international community's response to an invasion of Ukraine is perceived by the Chinese government as weak, do you think that increases the probability that the government of China might actually embark on an incursion to reunify by force with Taiwan?
So I'll take a stab at that, Mr. Chair. I think we're talking about it because absolutely this is a talking point that those risks, the risks of what might happen in Ukraine have an impact globally. And we are concerned that not just China, but others might seek to learn lessons or draw conclusions from that. And so we'll continue to have those conversations with our allies, both in Europe and around the world.
Thank you very much, Mr. Morantz. We'll have to leave it there in the interest of time. Thank you, Mr. Epp. We'll go to Mr. Isasi now, please, for 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Allow me to also thank all the witnesses for their testimony today. Mr. Epp, allow me to start off with really good news. The fact that we did launch exploratory discussions for the FAAE earlier this year. Now, would you mind sharing with us what you think the timeframes will be going forward?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. We have the benefit of a real expert on that in Ms. Spears, so I'll turn to her.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, as I've noted, we do have forthcoming meetings scheduled to undertake those exploratory discussions with Taiwan towards a future FIPA. We have meetings scheduled in February and in March. These are designed to assess our relative levels of ambition. We would then be in a position to recommend whether to proceed to formal negotiations. And it is hoped that those exploratory discussions can also ensure that when we do, or should we proceed to formal negotiations, that these would move relatively quickly.
And would it be correct to say that Taiwan is the most significant trade partner we have, with which we have yet to negotiate a FIPA? Is that correct?
So I won't comment on that. I will note that Canada has recently completed a review of its model FIPA agreement. And so we are now in the process of reinvigorating our FIPA program, including with a number of partners.
So is there any other jurisdiction with which we do more give and take, more trade, more bilateral investment than Taiwan, with which we do not as of yet have an agreement?
I'm sorry, I can't comment on that. I mean, there's many considerations taken into account as we look where we would consider FIPAs with potential partners.
Okay. Could you likely share with us how many OECD countries actually have already negotiated FIPA agreements with Taiwan?
Sorry, I don't have that information at hand.
Okay, but what are our significant trading partners that already have a FIPA with Taiwan? Can you name a few of them?
I'm sorry, I'll have to follow up on that.
If I might suggest, can we turn to Jordan Reeves, who follows this closely, and I'm not sure, Jordan, whether you can add to that.
Right, well then, I can't give you the exact answer, but I can tell you that Taiwan does have FIPAs with a number of its trading partners. Those include many of its diplomatic allies. I don't think all of the 14. Also, I think more recent FIPAs, similar agreements, they're not exactly the same as ours. Some of these don't have full dispute settlement mechanisms as part of the agreements, but India and Vietnam are two recent examples of agreements, investment-related agreements that Taiwan completed recently.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. And at this preliminary stage, I'm not quite sure who this should go to, but what sectors in our country can expect better prospects as we move forward in the event we hopefully negotiate a FIPA? What sectors in Canada stand to gain?
Mr. Chair, I just wanted to note that should we proceed with FIPA negotiations, it's largely about establishing investment protection. So it lays down protections for our investors abroad against any potential discriminatory treatment and expropriation. It is about reaffirming our commitment to a predictable framework.
Ms.
So
Spears,
I'm
not asking about the substance. I'm talking about what sectors appear to be most promising for us in Canada should we negotiate an agreement?
So it's not linked to any particular sectors. It's designed to foster a
okay.
Stronger
So no estimates.
Mr. Chair, if I might,
thank you,
Mr. Chair. If I might, we've seen very positive two-way investment, including in the health sector, including in environment, clean energy. We see increased interest in biotech, and of course, we're all very interested in seeing further investments and cooperation in the IT sector, not least chips. So I think, as my colleague mentioned, the arrangement would be about building broader confidence across sectors, but those are all very promising sectors that we work with our CTOT in Taipei hard at growing.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Sassi. We'll have to leave it there in the interest of time. Maintenant, je passe la parole à Monsieur Bergeron pour...
Now, Mr. Bergeron, you have the floor for 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to come back to the topic that Mr. Epp began speaking about concerning the reaction of China after an overture of Taiwan in Vilnius in Lithuania. How can we explain that? Well, many countries, including Canada, have informal relationships with China. Is this a sign of a tightening up by the PRC in terms of the establishment of any new relationships with Taiwan?
I think we'll continue to take note of and be concerned with and work with partners to push back on a sort of moving of the goalposts approach that we've seen. And that's with respect to Taiwan's international space, both in terms of bilateral arrangements it may have unofficially with other partners, so the case in point being Lithuania, but also with respect to Taiwan's participation in organizations within which it is already a member, be it APEC or be it the WTO. And time doesn't permit now, but there are examples where we see activity by one side that would seek to downgrade its longstanding role and access. And so those again are part of the examples I was giving earlier. We're alive both to military exercises and threats, but also other ways in which pressure is being put on Taiwan around the world.
I know that I have little time left, Mr. Chair, but I'd like to come back to the answer given by Mr. Hamilton to my colleague Genuis concerning AUKUS. I understand that the reservation that Canada had about joining that alliance, and I know that these countries concerned have nuclear submarines. How can we reconcile that with the fact that Canada is part of the of NATO, and some members do have nuclear submarines?
Well, Mr. Chair, of course, different countries will assess their defense and security needs in different ways. I can say that right now, our assessment is that Canada was not in need of nuclear submarines at this time. But I can say, to the extent that Australia is arguably our closest partner and ally in the Indo-Pacific, they determined that they needed that resource, and from our perspective, that can only be a good thing. It increases our opportunities for interoperability with the Australians. It enhances their security and defense situation. And so to the extent that we're close partners and allies with the Australians, we believe it enhances our security and defense as well.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Bergeron. Merci.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bergeron. Madam McPherson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Really quickly, I just did want, this isn't a question, but I did just want to clarify that the feminist foreign policy is not the same as the FIAP, the Feminist International Assistance Policy, and it is so important with regards to the feminist foreign policy that it includes all aspects of Canada's role in the world, including defense, including diplomacy, including trade. So not wanting to focus on that development side when we look at the feminist foreign policy. Now, unfortunately, I don't have questions for our guests right now, because I would like to take the remainder of my time to move my motion that I had brought forward previously. I really do thank the witnesses for being here, and I do look forward to having the opportunity to study Taiwan in further detail going forward. But knowing where we are in Canada, knowing that I have now asked the US ambassador to Canada to come to this committee to answer questions on foreign money being used to fuel these projects, I think it's really important to recognize that yesterday the Give Send Go website was hacked. It was redirected to an illegal leak of who the donors are. The document indicates that 56% of the donors are from the US, and that foreign donors account for nearly half of the dollar amount, that work emails were tied to these donations, including from the US Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security, and that while there was a recent provincial order to freeze the funds, the convoy organizers, as well as Give Send Go, have been looking for ways around this order. This is a national emergency. Clearly, it has dragged on much longer than it should have due to a lack of leadership, due to a lack of action, and it needs to be addressed swiftly. This committee is a perfect place for us to be looking at this concern of foreign interference in relation to the convoy and the need to elevate this issue, particularly since the organizers who have a say in managing the funds have expressed hate, white supremacy, and a stated goal to appoint themselves into an unelected position of government and dissolve the current government. So I would like to move that motion and ask for the committee to consider it and vote for it, please, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Ms. McPherson. So the motion has been moved. It's in order. It was communicated to members within the notice period and is now formally moved. That means members now have the opportunity to debate that motion. Because we are in a hybrid format in the sense that we have at least two members in the room in person and the rest of us online, I would like to ask the clerk and colleagues to help me
Mr. Chair, I
establish
just have a point
order.
of clarification.
Yes.
I just want to clarify that this is the motion on the U.S. ambassador and not the...
That is my understanding.
Okay, because there were two motions,
Ms.
I think,
McPherson
that
is,
Ms. McPherson
right.
tabled.
And happy to read the motion if that would provide clarity, Mr. Chair.
Why don't we ask you to do that, just to be absolutely sure? Please go ahead.
Wonderful. That the committee request the appearance of David L. Cohen, Ambassador of the United States to Canada, to appear for a period of 1 hour to entertain questions from the committee in regard to concerns American influence supporting a group in Canada who has a stated goal to dissolve the government of Canada, including concerns of funding and being collected and distributed by American companies towards this goal, and concerns regarding American in positions of authority encouraging Americans to support the call to dissolve the Canadian government with funding that is foreign to Canada.
Thank you very much, Ms. McPherson. And going back to my earlier point with respect to the establishment of the speakers list, I know we have members in the room as well as online. Online, it's easy if I could ask you to use the raise hand feature. And once you've spoken, to lower it to go back in the queue. And I will ask the clerk if there are interventions that are being sought from the floor and to let me know so that I can develop an integrated speakers list. Right now, I have Mr. Oliphant who has his hand raised virtually. Mr. Oliphant, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. McPherson, for the motion. However, I would not be in favor of it for two principal reasons, one on process and one on content. The process is we took quite a while getting our committee going. We have an ambitious agenda. Today's meeting is on just a start of the Taiwan study. We still continue with Ukraine, which is one of the most pressing issues for most Canadians beyond our borders. Taiwan is extremely important, and I'm already getting some ideas now, thanks to Mr. Bergeron's idea that we delay our witnesses for a while because I am getting more questions, and which I think is going to be helpful as we move ahead. And then we also have the important study on vaccine equity, and we'll be having a briefing on that. So for those reasons, the principal reason would be that I believe we have done some good work getting an agenda. The second reason is I don't think that issue trumps our important agenda, also mainly because it is the issue that is being raised in the content of the motion is really not about a state-to-state issue that would be appropriately addressed by the ambassador of the United States to Canada. I think that he would not be the best witness for us to do that. So for those reasons, I will not be supporting it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Oliphant. I have Dr. Fry and then Mr. Chong. And just in the meantime, colleagues, since we're now in a discussion that involves other substance than the substance that our witnesses have come to testify, and in the interest of their scheduled time, I'm wondering if the committee would agree that we can release our witnesses at the moment with our thanks for their service and for their expertise and testimony. Any objection?
Yeah, I object. I have a quick point of order after my intervention.
And that relates to the witnesses, Mr. Chung. In that case, we will ask them just to stand by.
Does indeed. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. So we have Dr. Fry and then you, Mr. Chung. Dr. Fry, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, Chair. I wanted to also agree with my colleague Rob Oliphant saying that I do not and I cannot support this motion. We have what everyone every day is saying could be any moment war in Ukraine between And we have Taiwan, which is also, we've been asking the questions and hearing the answers, is China going to take a page out of Russia's book if they get to accept? These are important and urgent issues. I agree with Mr. Oliphant as well, that this is not a state-to-state issue. It's not the United States of America's government that's got people running around in our country, GoFundMe and getting all kinds of money, et cetera, et cetera. I think these are things that may be done if they need to be done in a bilateral manner with FinTrack and all of that, getting our government to say to them, can you check where the money's going? Can you follow the money for us? But this is not an urgent issue. We've too many more urgent things, and I will therefore be voting against it.
Dr. Fry, thank you very much. Mr. Chung.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with everything Mr. Oliphant said in respect of this motion. And if I may, Mr. Chair, since I wasn't able to have my 5-minute round, on a point of order, I'm wondering if I could just read a question quickly into the record and ask the witnesses to respond to the clerk in writing to that question after the meeting is completed.
I think, yes, that's. I was going to suggest to members that option is available.
So I'll just read it quickly my question to the record. Canada is a signatory and has ratified the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, a legally binding treaty, as has the People's Republic of China. Under this convention, the United Nations appointed a tribunal at the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague. In a clear and binding ruling, the tribunal ruled on July 12, 2016, and found that the People's Republic of China's claim to the South China Sea and its 9-dash line are invalid. Does Canada support and agree with the tribunal's ruling, which renders the People's Republic of China's claims in the South China Sea null and void? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chung, thank you very much. I see that Mr. Hamilton has his hand raised. If he wishes to come in, I'm mindful of the time frame or the timeline that the witnesses are under with respect to other obligations they may have. So if that will settle the remaining point outstanding to them, let's tackle that now. Mr. Hamilton?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. With your indulgence and with my apologies to Mr. Chong for my first answer to his questions. He asked at that time about transit of the Taiwan Strait. I answered that, I believe, accurately. He asked a question about maritime claims in the South China Sea. I answered that mostly accurately in saying that generally Canada does not take a position. But as he's just read out for the record, he did ask that very specific question about the tribunal's ruling in 2016, where we do have a view, and happy to provide that in writing or to defer to my colleagues, Stephen Randall, who's on the panel and is director of our Oceans Law Division at Global Affairs Canada.
In the interest of time, Mr. Hamilton, if it could be provided in writing, that would close out the panel discussion of today's meeting. We do have a motion on the floor, but I wanted to make sure that you and your colleagues are able to get on your way and with the rest of your day. Thank you, Mr. Chong. Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. We will allow our witnesses then to connect, and again with our thanks, and particularly to Mr. Reeves, for whom it's now very late. Thank you again for your testimony this afternoon. We will now go back to the motion under discussion. And I don't immediately see any speakers. Is anybody else wishing to speak on the motion that was put forward by Ms. McPherson? Dr. Fry.
Chair, I have to go. I have a committee meeting, and I'm sorry, I have to say that I would move that we adjourn.
Okay, there's a motion to adjourn on the floor. Madam Clerk, just procedurally, that's dilatory and supersedes any other motion.
Yes, Mr. Chair.
I just had a point of clarity.
One second, Ms. McPherson. I just wanted to check with the clerk what procedurally happens now. Does that supersede the motion under discussion?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, it does. You should proceed immediately to a vote on the question of should the committee adjourn.
So we have a dilatory motion, Ms. McPherson, to adjourn, and there's no other margin to engage in debate. So we will put that vote. Madam Clerk, if you could take, is there any objection to adjourning? There's at least one objection. So why don't we do a recorded vote?
I am objecting to adjourning. I would like to move to a vote on Ms. McPherson's motion and adjourn after, so I'm against it.
Okay, so let's call the vote on adjournment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The question is on the motion of that the committee do now adjourn. Ms. Van Duyn.
No.
Mr. Isasi.
No.
Dr. Fry. I'm sorry, Dr. Fry, I could not hear you.
Yes.
Mr. Oliphant,
No.
Mr. Sarai,
No.
Mr. Abultaif,
No.
Mr. Chong,
No.
Mr. Genuis,
No.
Mr. Morantz,
No.
Monsieur Bergeron,
No.
and Ms. McPherson.
No.
Mr. Chair, that is 10 nays and 1 yay.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. The motion to adjourn is defeated. We are back to discussion on the motion, and I invite colleagues to once again raise their hands. If there's no further debate, we will go to a vote. And I want to make absolutely sure, seeing no further debate on the motion, Madam Clerk, if you could take us through a vote on Ms. McPherson's motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The vote on the motion. Ms. Bendayan.
No.
Mr. Isasi.
No.
Dr. Fry.
No.
Mr. Oliphant.
No.
Mr. Sarai.
No.
Mr. Abultaif.
No.
Mr. Chong.
No.
Mr. Genuis.
No.
Mr. Morantz.
No.
Monsieur Bergeron.
Oui.
Ms. McPherson.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That is 2 in favor and 9 against.
Thank you very much, Madam Clerk. The motion is defeated. We are at 1 o'clock. It's at the time that's scheduled for us. We've concluded our work with the panel. Colleagues, with your agreement, we stand adjourned until our next meeting. Please keep safe. Merci beaucoup.